The emergency session with the Caliph High Council took place in a communication chamber deep within the station, where holographic projectors created the illusion that the counselors were actually present. 12 Caliph elders appeared around the curved table, their scales ranging from deep blue to silver gray, with Ajavrith stood before them with the cubs nearby. And Una stood to the side with her hands clasped in front of her. The council had been told everything. They had seen the security footage of the cubs tearing through barriers. They had read the medical reports about the imprint. Bombay had reviewed Una's biological scans and psychological evaluations. Now they wanted to hear from the human herself. "You are Una Siang," the eldest counselor said. "I am." "You are the one who bonded with Ambassador Vreth's children." "They bonded with me," Una corrected gently. "But yes." Explain to this council why a prey species would risk so much for young that are not her own. Una took a breath and tried to find the right words. "Humans do not see children the way you do," she said. "I mean no offense by that, but our species has a different relationship with the young. Explain. On our world, we take care of children who are not related to us by blood. And we do it all the time, and it is not strange or shameful. And it is just what we do." The counselors exchanged glances. "We adopt children whose parents cannot care for them," Una continued. "And we raise the offspring of friends and family members who have died. And we take in young animals and nurture them as if they were our own cubs. But the cubs you speak of are not helpless creatures," another counselor said. "And they are Caliph. And they could kill you with a single swipe of their claws." "Yes, and this does not frighten you?" Una thought about the question carefully. "It frightened me at first," she admitted. "But fear is not the only thing I felt when I looked at them. And I saw children who were scared and alone, and I could not walk away from that. And I do not think I could ever walk away from that, even if it cost you your life." "Even then," the eldest counselor leaned forward. "Human," the elder said, "we have watched your species from afar for many cycles, and we classified you as prey because you are small and soft and lack natural weapons. But I am beginning to think we misunderstood something fundamental about your kind." "What do you mean?" "A true prey species runs from danger. And a true prey species protects only its own blood. And a true prey species does not sit calmly in a corridor full of predator young and wait for them to decide she is safe." The counselor's scales had shifted to a thoughtful purple. "You are not prey," the elder continued. "And you are not predator either, and you are something else entirely. And I do not know if our categories have a word for what you are." Breath spoke for the first time. "The cubs have chosen her," the ambassador said. "And I have resisted this truth because it brought shame upon my house. But I watched my children tear through metal to reach her, and I watched them stand against me to protect her. And I cannot deny what I have seen." "What are you suggesting?" "Ambassador, I am suggesting that we consider a path that has no precedent in our history," the counselors murmured among themselves finally. The eldest raised a hand for silence. "Human Una Siang," the elder said. "This council has a question for you. Ask it. If we offered you a place among us, would you take it? And would you leave your own kind behind to travel with our delegation and help raise these cubs who have chosen you?" Una felt her heart beating very fast. She had not expected this. She had hoped for acknowledgement, maybe even acceptance. She had not imagined being offered a place in the Caliph pack. "I would need to know what that means," she said carefully. "It means you would be named Vathra, which is a word we have not used for an outsider in recorded history. And it means guardian, and it means one who protects the young. And it means pack without blood. And it means you would have a formal place in our society and our delegation. And our family." The cubs had been watching the proceedings. With unusual patience now, Rin stood up and walked to Una's side. Sefka. Followed climbed into her arms. They had made their choice. Clear long ago now, it was her turn. Yes. Una said. The word came out steady and sure. Yes, I will take this path. And yes, I will help raise them. And yes, I will leave what I know behind for their sake. The eldest counselor nodded. Slowly, then it is done. Holographic images of the counselors flickered and faded as the session ended. Reth stood alone with Una and the cubs in the suddenly quiet chamber for a long moment. Neither of them spoke. Then Vreth did something that Una had never seen a Caliph do before. The ambassador lowered its head in a gesture of respect. I was wrong about you, Vreth said. I know. You are very strange. Human. I know that too. Vreth made a sound that might have been laughter. Welcome to the pack, Faithra. The departure happened the next morning, with a crowd gathered to watch. Delegates from dozens of species lined the corridors as the Caliph walked toward their ship. Una walked with them. The cubs surrounded her, and Rin walked on her left while Sethka walked on her right, while Tarek rode on her shoulders with his small claws. Gripping her jacket, she was leaving everything. She had known her laboratory and her research and her quiet life on the Eris station, but she was not sad. She was walking toward something new. Something that had no precedent. Something that would change how the galaxy thought about humans and predators and the bonds that formed between unlikely souls. The other humans on the station watched her go. Some of them smiled, some of them wiped tears from their eyes. All of them understood. This was what humans did. They found the scared and the small and the lost. They stayed when others ran. They loved without conditions and protected without limits. And sometimes, when they were very lucky, they found a pack that loved them back. Una stepped onto the Caliph ship with 3 predator cubs pressed against her legs. The door closed behind her, and somewhere in the vastness of space, a new family began its journey home. Vreth made the announcement on a cold station morning when the artificial lights were still dim and most species were just beginning to stir. The Caliph delegation would be leaving early. The diplomatic talks were not complete, but Vreth had decided that the situation with the cubs was more important than any treaty. They would return to the homeworld where distance and time would break the unnatural bond. Cubs would forget the human. Eventually, they would heal and grow and become proper Caliph who did not shame their lineage by clinging to prey species. Una heard the news from the station commander, who delivered it with a face full of regret. I tried to convince them to stay, the commander said, but I have no authority to stop a delegation from leaving. When do they go? Tomorrow morning. First light cycle. Una thanked the commander and returned to her quarters and sat on her bed and tried not to think about what would happen to the cubs when they were taken away from her. The Caliph physicians had explained imprint bonds to her. During the testing process, they had told her how the cubs would suffer when separated from her. They had described the symptoms in clinical terms: decreased appetite, disrupted sleep, behavioral regression, emotional withdrawal. They had called it a temporary condition that would resolve itself over time, but Una had seen the look in their eyes when they said it. She knew they were not telling her everything. She knew that temporary could mean months or years of suffering for 3 small creatures who had done nothing wrong except trust her that night. She did not sleep. She sat in her cabin and waited for the cubs to arrive through their usual route. When they did not come, she knew something was wrong. The Caliph had finally figured out how to keep them contained. She imagined Rin pacing in circles. Unable to reach her, she imagined Sethka hiding under furniture again. Alone and scared, she imagined Torek sitting by a door that would not open, waiting for a human who could not come. The hours passed slowly. Then, somewhere around the middle of the night cycle, Una heard a sound that made her heart stop. It was a distant crash, the sound of metal giving way under tremendous force. Then another crash, closer this time. Then alarms began to wail. Yuna ran to her door and opened it just in time to see Rin come barreling around the corner of the corridor. The cub was breathing hard, and its scales were scraped and bleeding in several places. But its eyes were bright with determination. Behind Rin came Sethka, moving with the careful precision of someone who had just disabled a very complicated security system. And behind Sethka came Torek, glancing back over his shoulder to make sure no one was following. They had escaped, not through the vents this time. They had gone straight through the walls. Rin had torn through a security bulkhead, a barrier designed to withstand explosive decompression. The cub had shredded metal that should have been impossible to breach, all to reach Yuna, to be with her one more time. The cub surrounded her in the corridor, pressing close and making those rumbling sounds that meant safety and belonging. Yuna knelt down and held them, and felt tears running down her face. "You impossible creatures," she whispered. The sound of running footsteps echoed from both ends of the corridor. Station security arrived first, weapons drawn. Then the Caliph guards appeared, their scales flushed dark with anger. And finally, Vreth came around the corner with a look on the ambassador's face that Yuna had never seen before. Was not anger, it was something closer to awe. The cubs heard their parents' footsteps and reacted instantly. They turned to face Vreth. They positioned themselves in front of Yuna and Rin. The largest and boldest of the three bared its teeth at its own parent and let out a growl that echoed off the metal walls. They were protecting her, these predator cubs, these children of a species that had conquered worlds and built empires, were protecting a small soft human from their own kin. Vreth stopped walking. Ambassador stared at the cubs with scales shifting through colors that Yuna did not recognize behind Vreth. The other Caliph guards had gone very still. "They will not let you take me," Yuna said quietly. "I can see that. If you try to force them, they will fight. I can see that too." Yuna stood up slowly, keeping her hands visible and her movements calm. The cubs stayed in front of her, ready to defend her against anything. "Ambassador Vreth," she said, "I am not your enemy, and I never wanted any of this. And I know you think I stole your children somehow, but that is not what happened. Then what did happen? They were scared, and I was calm, and that is all. And I know that sounds too simple, but sometimes simple things have complicated consequences." Vreth was silent for a long moment. The ambassador looked at the cubs, really looked at them. Rin with its scraped scales and fierce protective stance, Sethka with her clever eyes still tracking the movements of every guard. Torek with his small body planted firmly between Yuna and any potential threat. They tore through a security bulkhead. Vreth said finally, "Yes, that should not be possible for cubs their age. No, they did it for you. They did it because they love me." Yuna said, "And I know that is hard for you to accept. But it is the truth, and punishing them for it will not change it. And taking them away will not erase it. And the only thing that will happen if you force them to leave is that 3 children will suffer for something they cannot control." The corridor was very quiet. Vreth's scales had settled into a color Yuna had never seen before, something soft and uncertain. "What do you suggest?" the ambassador asked. "Let me say goodbye properly, and let them understand that I am not being taken from them, and let them choose whether they want to go with you. And if they choose not to go..." Yuna looked down at the cubs. They looked back at her with absolute trust in their eyes. "Then we figure out something else," she said. The security footage spread through the station like fire through dry grass. Someone had compiled clips of the cubs escaping their quarters, and suddenly everyone was watching. The video showed Rin tearing through a reinforced panel with claws that should not have been strong enough for this task. They showed Sethka studying door mechanisms with patient intensity until she found the weakness that would let her through. They showed Torek memorizing patrol patterns and leading his siblings through gaps in the security grid, and every video ended the same way, the cubs arriving at Yuna's door, the cubs pressing against her when she let them in, the cubs sleeping in a pile around her as if she were the safest place in the universe. Species from across the station watched these clips and talked about what they meant. The Veluxi, a species of traders known for their love of gossip, spread the story to 3 other stations within a week. The Morthani, ancient beings who rarely commented on anything, released a formal statement noting that they had never seen predator young choose a prey species before. Even the collective, a hive mind species that usually ignored individual dramas, expressed what might have been curiosity. Yuna became famous without wanting to be. She could not walk through the station without feeling eyes on her. Some looks were curious, some were skeptical, some were hostile, especially from the Kelith guards, who blamed her for the embarrassment their delegation was suffering. Vreth increased the pressure. The ambassador filed formal complaints with station command, demanding Yuna's removal on grounds of cultural interference. When that failed, Vreth accused her of using unknown human technology to manipulate the cubs. When that accusation could not be proven, Vreth suggested that humans must produce some kind of pheromone that affected predator species. This final claim gained traction among some of the other delegations. Humans were new to the galactic community. After all, nobody really knew what they were capable of. Maybe they did have some hidden biological trick that let them influence other species. Yuna heard these rumors and felt something harden inside her chest. She had done nothing wrong. She had helped frighten children when they needed help, and now she was being painted as some kind of predator herself, a manipulator who used secret weapons to steal cubs from their parents. The injustice of it burned in her throat every time she swallowed, so she made a decision. She went to station command and made a formal request. She would submit to a complete biological scan. She would allow the Kelith to examine every aspect of her physiology. She would open herself to psychological evaluation and cultural review and any other tests they wanted to conduct. If they found evidence of manipulation, she would accept whatever punishment they deemed appropriate. If they found nothing, they would have to admit that she was simply human and nothing more. The station commander tried to talk her out of it. "You do not have to do this," the commander said, "and the test could be invasive, and the Kelith might use this as an opportunity to humiliate you further." "I know," Yuna said. "Then why?" "Because those cubs are suffering when they are away from me, and the only way to help them is to prove that I am not the monster Vreth is making me out to be." The test began the next day. They were everything the commander had warned her about, and worse. The Kelith physicians took samples of her blood and her skin and her hair. They scanned her brain and her organs and every gland in her body. They subjected her to hours of psychological questioning, probing her motivations and her history and her feelings about the cubs. They tested her for pheromones and chemical signals, and any form of biological communication that might have influenced the young Kelith. Yuna endured all of it. She answered every question honestly. She let them poke and prod and examine her without complaint when they asked her why she had sat down in that corridor instead of running away. She told them the truth. They were scared, and running would have made them more scared. And I could not do that to children, even children who might have killed you, the lead physician asked. Even then, the results came back after 3 days of analysis. There was no evidence of manipulation, no pheromones, no technology, no tricks of any kind. Yuna Xian was exactly what she appeared to be, a human woman with slightly elevated levels of patience and an unusual tolerance for stressful situations, nothing more. The Kelith physicians delivered their findings to Vreth in a formal session that Yuna was not allowed to attend, but she heard about what happened afterward. She heard that Vreth had demanded they run the tests. Again, she heard that the physicians had refused, stating that their equipment was accurate and their methods were sound. She heard that Vreth had finally fallen silent and stared at the report for a long time before dismissing everyone from the room. The other delegations heard too. The Veluxi spread the news within hours. The human had let herself be examined like a specimen in a laboratory. She had allowed predators to study her body and her mind. She had done all of this not to defend herself, but to help cubs that were not hers. The Marthani released another statement. The humans continue to surprise us. They said Yuna did not feel like a surprise. She felt tired and sore and emotionally drained, but when she returned to her quarters that night and found all 3 cubs waiting at her door, she felt something else too. She felt like she had made the right choice. Rin pressed against her leg. Sefka butted her hand with its head. Tara climbed into her arms the moment she sat down. They did not know what she had done for them. They only knew that she was there, and that she was safe, and that she loved them for now. That was enough. The cubs were returned to the Keleth quarters under heavy guard, and Yuna was escorted to her own cabin with instructions to stay there until further notice. She sat on her small bed and stared at the wall and wondered how a simple walk through a corridor had turned into a diplomatic crisis. The station commander called her 3 times that night. Each call was shorter than the last and filled with the same desperate question. What exactly happened in that corridor? Yuna told the truth each time. She had found frightened children, and she had stayed calm, and somehow that calm had convinced them she was safe. The commander did not seem satisfied with this answer, but there was nothing else Yuna could offering the Keleth quarters. Problems were multiplying by the hour. Rin paced in circles around the room and refused to eat the fresh meat that was placed before it. Sefka had crawled under a piece of furniture and would not come out for anyone. Torek sat by the door and stared at it with an intensity that made the adult Keleth uncomfortable. The cubs were not sick in any way the physicians could identify. Their bodies were healthy, and their vital signs were normal, but something was wrong with them. Something that made them restless and irritable and completely uninterested in food or play or sleep. Vreth watched the cubs with growing concern. The ambassador had raised 3 children before and had never seen behavior like this when Rin finally did eat. It took only a few bites before pushing the food away and returning to its endless pacing. The Keleth physicians consulted their databases and spoke to specialists on the homeworld, and eventually came back with an answer that Vreth did not want to hear. The cubs had partially imprinted on the human. Imprinting was a natural process for Keleth, young during moments of extreme fear. Their minds locked onto any presence that offered safety and calmness. Bond was meant to connect cubs to their parents or pack members, the individuals who would protect them as they grew. But the cubs had been afraid and alone when they found Yuna, and she had been the only calm presence available. Their instincts had done what instincts always did. They had latched onto Vreth demanded a solution. The physicians had none to offer. Imprint bonds faded over time if the bonded individual was removed, but the process was slow and often painful for the young. The cubs would experience something like grief, a constant low-level distress that could affect their development and their health. Bring the human here? Vreth finally said. Ambassador. One of the guards began. I am not asking. Vreth replied. Yuna arrived at the Keleth quarters under escort. Walking through doors that bore warning signs in 12 different languages, she had no idea what to expect. What she found was chaos the moment she stepped into the room. The cubs reacted. Rin stopped pacing and lifted its head with ears pressed forward. Sethka emerged from under the furniture for the first time in our story, let out a sound that was somewhere between a bark and a cry, and ran toward her at full speed. Yuna barely had time to brace herself before all three cubs were pressing against her, climbing over each other to get closer, making those low rumbling sounds that vibrated through her chest. She knelt down and let them surround her, running her hands over their scales and murmuring soft words that they probably could not understand. It did not matter what she said. What mattered was that she was there. Vreth watched from across the room with an expression that Yuna could not read. The ambassador's scales had gone a pale gray color that might have indicated shock or disgust or something else entirely. They have imprinted on you, Vreth said. I gathered that. Yuna replied, this is not natural, and it is not acceptable. I did not do it on purpose. That does not matter, Vreth said. And the words came out sharp enough to make the cubs look up from their reunion with Yuna. What matters is that my children have bonded with a prey species, and this will bring shame upon my house and my delegation and my entire lineage. Yuna felt something cold settle in her stomach. She had read enough about Caliph culture to know that shame was not a small thing to them. It was a weight that could crush families and end careers and sometimes even end lives. What do you want me to do? She asked. I want you removed from this station, Vreth said, and I have already filed the request with Station Command. The cubs must have sensed something in the ambassador's tone because they pressed closer to Yuna, and Rin let out a low warning growl. Yuna put a calming hand on the cub's head. And if they refuse to remove me, then I will find other ways. The visit was cut short. After that, Yuna was escorted back to her quarters with strict instructions not to approach the Caliph section of the station again. She followed these instructions for exactly 2 days. And the third night, she woke to a strange scratching sound at her door. When she opened it, she found Tarek sitting in the corridor with a piece of ventilation grating clutched in its small claws. The cub had torn through the maintenance tunnels to reach her. Yuna stared at the cub. The cub stared back. How did you even find me? She whispered. Edtrek did not answer, obviously, but it pushed past her into the cabin and climbed onto her bed and curled up, as if this was exactly where it belonged. The next morning, station security found Sethka in the hallway outside Yuna's door, having followed the same path through the vents. By the end of the week, all three cubs had mastered the route. They came every night without fail. They disabled door sensors and avoided security patrols and tore through any barrier that stood between them and their human. The station's maintenance crew submitted 17 repair requests in 7 days. Vreth was furious. The other delegations were fascinated, and Yuna began to realize that this situation was not going to resolve itself. Quietly, the cubs had made their choice. They had chosen her over their own quarters and their own kind, and every rule that said they should stay away now. She had to decide what she was willing to do for them in return. Orbital Station Violin 9 floated in the darkness between 3 star systems, a massive structure of metal and glass, where species from across the galaxy came to talk and trade, and sometimes argue about borders that existed only on maps. Yuna Xiang had been on the station for 6 months now, working in a small laboratory where she studied plant samples from worlds she would probably never visit. She was a xenobiologist, which meant she spent most of her days looking through microscopes and writing reports that nobody seemed to read. Humans were new to this part of the galaxy, and the other species treated them like children who had wandered into an adult conversation. Yuna did not mind the quiet work. She had learned patience, growing up in a large family where everyone talked at once, and the only way to be heard was to wait until the noise stopped. That patience would soon matter more than She could have known the Caliph delegation arrived on a morning when Yuna was eating breakfast alone in the lower cafeteria. She heard the announcement over the station speakers and watched through the window as their ship docked. The Caliph were predators from a high-gravity world, and everything about them announced this fact. They stood over 2 meters tall with 6 limbs and scales that shifted color with their moods. Their teeth could tear through metal, and their retractable claws had evolved to hunt creatures far more dangerous than anything Earth had ever produced. The galaxy classified species in the categories, and humans fell into the prey category: small, soft, no claws, no venom, no natural weapons beyond their strange, stubborn brains. The Caliph sat firmly at the top of the predator list. Yuna finished her breakfast and went to her laboratory. Expecting the day to pass like any other, she was wrong. The malfunction started 3 hours later. Alarm screamed through the corridors as a section of the station reported an atmospheric breach. It was a false alarm, the kind of glitch that happened on old stations. But nobody knew that in the first panicked minute as Yuna was walking through a restricted corridor on her way back from a supply pickup when the emergency doors slammed shut in front of her, and behind her she was trapped in a section that connected to the diplomatic quarters, and she was not alone. 3 shapes huddled in the corner of the corridor, pressed against each other and making sounds that were half growl and half whimper. They were Caliph cubs. Yuna had read about them in her cultural briefings. Caliph young were roughly the size of large dogs, with the same 6 limbs and scales as adults, but softer features and wider eyes. They were also extremely dangerous when frightened. Their claws and teeth were fully functional from birth, and their instinct when threatened was to attack. The briefings had been very clear on one point: non-Caliph were forbidden from approaching Caliph young under any circumstances. The penalty for violating this rule ranged from diplomatic incident to immediate execution, depending on how the Caliph were feeling that day. Yuna looked at the 3 cubs. They looked back at her with eyes that glowed faintly in the emergency lighting. The largest one, a cub with dark scales and a scar across its snout, bared its teeth and hissed. The sound was loud enough to echo off the metal wall. Yuna knew she should press herself against the far wall and wait for rescue. She knew the smart thing was to make herself as small and unthreatening as possible and hope the cubs did not decide she was a danger. Instead, she sat down. She lowered herself slowly to the floor, folded her legs beneath her, and placed her hands open on her knees. Then she did something that confused the cubs completely. She did nothing. She did not run. She did not scream. She did not make any sudden movements or loud noises. She simply sat and breathed and waited. The largest cub, the one she would later learn was named Rin, stopped hissing. It tilted its head and stared at her with an expression that might have been confusion. The second cub, Sethka, had pressed itself so far into the corner that it seemed to be trying to merge with the wall. The third cub, Torik, watched Yuna with wide, curious eyes that tracked every small movement she made. Minutes passed. The alarms continued to wail, but Yuna kept her breathing slow and steady. She had learned this technique years ago when working with frightened animals on Earth. Fear was contagious, but so was calm. If she could stay relaxed, the cubs might follow her. Ledrin took a step toward her, then Anatharuna did not move. The cub came close enough that she could smell it, a strange scent like copper and pine needles. It sniffed at her hand, and she felt the warmth of its breath against her skin. Then it did something that surprised her. It pressed its head against her palm and made a low rumbling sound deep in its chest. Ethka uncurled from the corner and crept forward, watching Rin with obvious uncertainty. When Yuna did not attack or run or do anything threatening, Sethka came close enough to sniff at her other hand. Turek was the last to approach, but when it did, It climbed directly into her lap and curled up as if it had known her all its life by the time the emergency doors opened and station security arrived. All three cubs had arranged themselves around Yuna like a protective formation. She sat in the center of them with her hands resting gently on their scales. And none of them were afraid anymore. The security team stared at her with expressions of pure horror. Behind them stood a Caliph adult, taller than the others and wearing the elaborate robes of a diplomatic ambassador. This was Vreth. The cub's parent and the leader of the Caliph delegation. Vreth's scales had gone a deep angry red, and when the ambassador spoke, the words came out as something between a growl and a roar. "What have you done to my children?" Yuna opened her mouth to explain, but she never got the chance. The cubs heard their parents' voice and reacted in a way that shocked everyone present. They pressed closer to Yuna and refused to move her in, positioned itself between Yuna and Vreth, and let out a warning hiss directed at its own parent. The security team did not know what to do. The Caliph guards did not know what to do. Vreth stood frozen in the doorway with scales shifting from red to a confused orange. Yuna understood what had happened even if nobody else did. The cubs had been terrified, and she had been the only calm presence in their moments of fear. They had bonded to her in the way young predators bonded to those who protected them. She had not meant for this to happen. She had only wanted to keep them calm until help arrived, but intentions did not matter to instinct. The cubs had made their choice, and they had chosen her. Vreth stepped forward with claws extended, and the cubs growled in unison. "Ambassador," Yuna said quietly, "I mean no harm to your children, and I did not do this deliberately. But if you approach aggressively right now, they will defend me, and someone will get hurt." The words hung in the air between them. Vreth stared at this small, soft human who sat surrounded by Caliph, young, as if she belonged there. "This is not over," the ambassador said. "I know," Yuna replied, and she was right.